Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm doing a solo by popular demand. Not something that I normally do for non-patrons, but it's a weird one. I've been asked multiple times to talk about my relationship to Robert Greene. Not a guy I know. We'll go into his history in a few minutes. And I don't always love the politics of Michael Hobbes, but Michael Hobbes's Books Could Kill episode on this book is not bad if you want to go into more detail than I'm going to go in here. But you may notice that with the exception of the 50th Law, which is a book that Greene wrote with 50 Cent, that I actually own all the Robert Greene books, and when I can get them in hardback. Now, you'll be surprised to know, because what I was asked to specifically the last few times I was asked to talk about this was to talk about this in the context of leadership. And I would like to say that the 48 Laws of Power is absolutely not a good book for leadership. We'll talk about why in a minute. If you want to have books that are not terrible, but still kind of banal on this, you're going to want The Laws of Human Nature, The 33 Strategies of War, and Robert Greene's book on mastery. Now, these are still help books. They're airport books. And they're weird for self-help books and airport books because Greene is a fascinating character who would tell you that he doesn't actually follow all of his advice in the 48 Laws of Power. Now, one of the reasons I say the Laws of Power is not good about leadership is because it's not about that. The 48 Laws of Power is about climbing up in hierarchical situations and institutions in a zero-sum way. It's kind of it's interesting in that it's basically a book that was cobbled together from anecdotes of classics about rises to power from, the Thucydides all the way through the Renaissance, with some modern things thrown here and there. That is chock full of quotes and anecdotes and all sorts of things. And it's an interesting set of books if you're a certain kind of person who and it makes sense that it was very popular in the entertainment set and in the corporate business world set. Now, the 48 Laws of Power are anecdotes taken from classical literature, which when you know who Robert Greene is, that makes a little bit more sense. Robert Greene is a dude who attended Berkeley, finished his degree at University of Wisconsin-Madison, got a BA in the classics, worked around 50 jobs, according to his own thing, and did things that a lot of writers do. I mean, I myself did, where you end up in the blue-collar world for a little while, you end up as an editor, maybe work as a teacher, as I still do, because that's where my passion lies. Sometimes you might even try your hand at being a movie writer, etc. And Greene also did a lot of things that in the 90s, and also a lot of young BAs with not a lot of prospects do, but with more education than sense. He went abroad. And he was trying to write a book on Julius Caesar in the mid-1990s, And an editor told him, hey, why don't you take these anecdotes and write a self-help book basically out of it? And that became this book. I like this book, not because it's useful as a means for self-help. The 48 Laws of Power would make you an unpleasant person. It would make you a sociopath. And also, many of the laws cancel each other out. All right. They're based on isolated examples. Their assumptions are the assumptions of rising up in the kinds of institutions that a leftist would never want to be in anyway. But as a way to kind of engage with the classical world, if you're not educated in the classics and the Renaissance, and to become, kind of cultured very quickly, even if in a facile way, this book is good for that. And I suspect that is why it became so popular amongst a certain set, because it makes reference to so many things from ancient Greece, etc. And in a fairly honest fashion, actually. Greene was decently educated in the classics. It creates a kind of useful book for introducing yourself to notions of power and hierarchical institutions. I would not follow this advice. Similarly, while this has been called a proto pickup artist manual, the book on seduction is actually also very much, although with much more kind of classical Indian stuff thrown in here. Deduced advice from classical romance tales, classic seductions, etc. I don't actually think this book is pickup artisty, but again, I also wouldn't say that it would work. It is not really based on sound research or anything like that. Also, if you've ever studied anthropology, human courting rites are highly variable and very context specific. There's hardly anything that I think is going to work in all scenarios. But again, I actually don't think this is a terrible book. A lot of people do. As far as like creating tension and ways to give people what they want and creating ways to get them to think about what wants are, it's not a terrible thing to read as long as you're not using it to try to become some kind of pickup artist player, because it's not going to work for you. These two books, however, the Mastery book and the book on war, I do think are useful, although they are, again, anecdotes based on slightly more contemporary research. And the book on war actually will help you start getting into oppositional, dealing with oppositional situations and strategies around that. Now, war is not an individual affair. War as a metaphor is extremely overused and in bad taste, particularly these days. But if you are going to actually read a Robert Greene book to start thinking about how leftist should think, thinking about war in a real sense should be something you should do. And once you read Greene, I'd start reading real scholars of war, both conservative, liberal, and liberal. I'd read John Dolan, aka the World Nerd. I would his two books from when he was running under the War Nerd persona as a persona in the aughts are actually quite good. I'd read William Lind. I'd read Clausewitz. I'd read Thucydides. I'd read about the OODA loop and Colonel John Boyd. I would read, as much as I could. This is just to get you to start thinking about strategy and war. Now, a lot of the things that come up in war strategy books aren't going to help you as a leftist because you can't do them. Like grand strategy on the scale of military procedures requires armies and whatnot. But I do think reading about modern warfare is better than taking the assumptions, which are often given by leftists, that the best thing that a leftist should do is like take Lenin's strategy based on the Prussian Central Command and generalize it forever. I think that's very silly. So a couple of things I'd say that I would, if I read any of these books, this is The Daily Loss is Just a Stealing. This is the one that I actually think is interesting because it's Robert Greene's attempt to actually like take what he's learned from the classics and put it in dialogue with psychology and anthropology. This is also the most self-helpy of the book, but I think it's the one that reflects his actual opinion because Greene is basically a progressive liberal. Despite his appeal, despite his appeal, I think probably the book on the laws of the human nature, even though I think it's highly reductive and still kind of an airport book, and the book on war actually would be places to start on leadership. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. The Indigenous Leadership Forum at the University of Victoria has people read the Laws of War. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary courses on Christian apologetics also has people read the Laws of War. So it's a good place to start, just going in there. Now, why I find the Greene books interesting is that, yes, they are basically self-help books of the airport variety, although they're packed with classical anecdotes and whatnot. I think they're actually a good place for you to start building a dialogue with ideas of the past in a practical way. And if you were to contrast this and take in something like Rodrigo Nunes, like Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, right, a book that I quite like on organization, or Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy, which is a book that I don't always like, but I think is probably one of the better books on how Marxists should try to orientate towards independence as well as dealing with political systems as they actually are. You can start building up models for yourself. The problem with most leftist strategic books is they don't actually encourage individual character traits. They just don't. They don't see that as important, even though a lot of leftists are also given to weird, almost cargo cult-like attitudes towards individual left figures, which I've never really understood. So how should you go about why would you even start to cultivate this in leadership? Why would you start with something as banal and chuddy as Robert Greene? Well, there's a lot of problems with the classical world. There's a book that I read. I don't have it right by me. Which doesn't argue that there is no human nature, but that it's so variable we don't know what it is, and that actually the whole weird problem, the problem of white white educated industrial rich developed students, that's not a good basis for the way humans have interacted in relatively egalitarian systems. It's not to say that all those systems are rational or whatnot. And while I also don't love it, but you can see it back there and the orange and red spines, the Graeber book on debt and on the Dawn of Everything. The Dawn of Everything is a book I would pair with Robert Greene, as many problems as I have with it, as a beginning to understand different forms of human relationships. Now, if the Greene laws focus on one thing, though, they are virtue models of action in particular context, and that is useful. that is very useful. I don't know that these are great ones to go for. Like I said, if you were to actually follow the 48 laws of power, you'd be a sociopath and you'd probably fail very quickly. I think the laws of war, even though I say it's a good place to start, is only a place to start, and it doesn't deal with the different theories of war and opposition and all that. It just kind of tries to deduce general principles for them. It is the deduction of principles that makes these interesting. It's also why they're given to being grifty. Leftist would want to ask yourself, okay, what is a leftist politics that encourages individual character building, but assumes that our goal is to operate in a relatively egalitarian way? How do we, and also, as I like to say, egalitarianism doesn't mean being a sucker. And by egalitarian, I do not mean egalitarian in the sense of we are all abstractly the same, or that we give each other handicaps so that we all have an equal meritocratic playing ground. I mean, in a sense of that, I assume everyone in an organization has the same right to power as me. And then as long as I'm participating in a kinship group, organization, or whatever, that we all have equal say. Now, we don't all have equal prowess for getting our say, manipulating people, etc. That's why some of these skills can be useful. But how do you deal with that? Try to argue your point, try to argue your faction's beliefs and that sort of thing while being a moral actor for yourself, because you need to be one, even though you are operating in an immoral or amoral space. Those are the things that these kind of books have to deal with that I find, frankly, dramatically lacking on the left, except in activist help formats. There's a lot of anarchisty kind of things that come out, like the left. If you've ever been to your local anarchist or queer bookstore, you often find a lot of left self-help that is similar to this. The problem with a lot of those models is they just kind of assume that, that their radical proposal actually is functional. So, what can you get from something like Robert Greene? You get the ability to deduce things into principles. All right. Now, don't read the whole framing of laws is misleading. These principles are not going to be laws. You don't, actually, I say deduce, actually, you're inducing principles, to be completely fair. Damn you, Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle for using deduction and deduction wrong. So you induct, you arrive at principles that are likely and probably true. You derive them from models in the past, and you set them out and you see how they work for you, knowing that if you came up with a list of principles, they may contradict and they're going to be context dependent. So while Greene's rules are interesting for this, and they're interesting for how you use the past, I wouldn't take them as laws. I wouldn't take any set of these kind of things as laws. All right. When you're trying to develop coteries for like left-wing leadership, you have to ask yourself, what are the traits that we would want in a person and want to cultivate in a person who is also operating in the context of a power egalitarian and free movement? What are those traits? And also, what are the baggages that people are going to come with given their prior class habitus, whatever stuff they come with as traumas, etc. And how do you help people overcome those to get what they want and to better benefit the collective whole? As I've said before, shit's fucked up. That's why you have a larger duty to get yourself together. And I'm finally seeing activist people pick up this language, I guess. But I'm worried that this will be taken into the 1970s culture of narcissism way, where we all reflect on ourselves and give up on our social goals. I think you can't do that. There's a reason, and people say I'm impatient with leftists, and it's actually quite funny. A Patreon said, "You're not impatient. You actually explain the same thing over and over again over the course of years, and you just get mad that people don't listen to you." And it's absolutely true. I was not as irate when I started podcasting in 2012. I was just as irascible because that's my personality, but I wasn't irate. And I'm actually chilled out on a lot of things. You didn't deal with me in 2017 and 18. Most of you are new here. And this channel's only existed for 2.5 to almost 3 years. But I wanted to talk about this and address this before people think that I think leftists should read Robert Greene at face value as a way to come to power, because this won't help you. But he does give you a way to look at examples in text and deduce rules from them. And I would just take those rules as orientations, provisional truths, context-specific things, and I'd also question them more than Greene does. But Greene's not trying to build a better person; he's trying to sell a book. Now, should leftists do this sort of thing? I would hope that they would start. Party cadre discipline is a terrible way to build up character. You should be building people up way before that point. If you want to talk about, communities and communalism and all that kind of stuff, that also requires virtues, and it also requires realizing people's limits and what can't be done at certain time periods and what can be done in others. Having immediate strategic goals and long-term goals, having demands that are absolute you won't budge on, and things that you will accept because it is democratically acceptable, even if you think it's wrong. These are all democratically acceptable. Most people believe something different than me. I have to accept that, or I have to opt out because I cannot accept that. And that's what the arduous institution believes. I do not belong in this institution. But you need to set up values for yourself, orientations. You should induce principles from the past. You should come up with relatively rigorous frameworks. And you should do this to be a leader. Because in a relatively polar egalitarian scenario, you could be a leader at any time. This is why I like Nicholas Nassam Taleb so much, even though he's also kind of a weird crank reactionary in a lot of ways. Is that you should be prepared to have skin in the game, regardless of your disadvantages, etc. And I think that also means sometimes we have to talk about what people can't do. Now, we shouldn't demoralize them or demean them or say there's no praise, because there's praise for almost everybody in these scenarios. But there's certain things we shouldn't be asking people with certain problems to do. We should be having them serve the community in ways that better suit them. You don't have someone in an impulse control problem go through an armed rally, because it can turn bloody very quickly. You don't ask a person who has trouble hearing to go be your prime listener, even though there's plenty of things they can do that probably would even utilize, say, deaf culture in ways that would be helpful to you. All right. You meet people where they are. You treat all assets and what people have as valid. And you even learn to see where some of these disabilities can be useful to society by creating new perspectives and ways in, or, helping us adjust and not just assume certain things. I think that's actually all very smart. And that's a progressive impulse that, as much as I complain about progressives, that one's not bad. And that's a smart virtue, actually, to include those people. But that also means realizing that people have limits, that we have a place for everybody and everybody's valuable. But there's some things you shouldn't ask. You shouldn't ask someone with PTSD certain things. You shouldn't, there's just certain things. that you should, as a leader, you shouldn't do. And so you want to cultivate people leading in a way, because they all might be a leader, that best suits who they already are with their advantages and disadvantages, because we're all different. And in that sense, we can't assume universal equality, because equality in that sense mathematically equals sameness. And we only want to do that about power. All right. This has been kind of a rambly answer to demand to talk about what I get out of Robert Greene, but that's what I get out of it. They're fun, stupid reads. If you are into classics and macho shit. And I would also say that I think, the Laws of Human Nature and the Strategies of War, and to a lesser degree, the Mastery books, those are actually kind of useful if you use them as launching off places to read more substantive stuff and to do more substantive stuff. The other thing I like about this is that it makes you realize that you learn to implement things. Like, the humanities is not about just learning for its own sake. It's about a set of soft skills and thinking skills and interpersonal skills that are very useful for people, and that are also class context dependent. Like, the way I talk to people, this is another thing. The way I talk to people in certain scenarios or others, like, I'm very directly blunt with blue collar workers, because that's how they tend to talk with themselves. And it's kind of code switching to learn that. Meeting people where they are and utilizing them and treating everyone as potentially equally valuable is the first thing in leadership. And the other thing is realizing that you might be a leader where you want to be a not, and everyone you know might be. So in that sort of sense, in a truly equal society, everyone has a responsibility to cultivate themselves, because they all may have skin in the game. And so starting with weird things like this isn't the worst thing to do. All right. I hope that explains why I even talked about this with Michael Brooks way back in the day at the weird Jordan Peterson conference in Idaho in 2018. My sense of time is getting strange. In 2018. Because Michael and I did talk about both Buddhism and also Robert Greene at that conference, in addition to talking about taking the right seriously and understanding strategies of subversion, and being able to intellectually interlock with people who are enemies, are just from different worldviews. And all people who share different worldviews are enemies. The whole Smithian friend enemy distinction applied to whole society is a disaster if you're not in power. And most leftists are not in power. It's useful to learn how to be an honorable opponent, and to see dehumanizing your opponent is not always the best way to win. Maybe these are the kinds of things you should think about if you're going to engage in politics, because leftists, by and large, don't win. And I don't think it's because of like power egalitarian principles. I think it's because of a whole lot of habits that we take out and do not question, and a whole lot of emotivism. And I'm doing a series on that that's going to be more rigorous than talking about Robert Greene. I'm going to go into AJ Iyer and how emotivism became a dominant modality, but how it's also a modality anyway in utilitarian and deontological logic, because the logics don't hold, and so emotive reasoning actually takes place there too. All right. I hope you found this helpful. If you want to, if you're going to start with a Green book, I might start with the Daily Laws and just see if you have a taste for what he's talking about, because that's just a smattering of a lot of his stuff. And then the two books that I would really suggest that might actually be useful for people are the 33 Strategies of War and the Laws of Human Nature. And then I'd start reading other stuff, including stuff like, even though I have a lot of criticisms of this book, but I do think that Dawn of Everything is a good way to start looking into anthropology, There's a couple books on grand strategy you might want to look at, revolutionary strategy, etc. You need to go into this, learn from people who you disagree with, learn from people whose worldview you do not share. I'm often accused of well poisoning by rightists because I'm never going to accept a lot of what they believe. But actually, the fact that I try to engage with them at all, and I'm not saying you should engage with every dumb right winger. In fact, I get annoyed how much time people waste on Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro because that's easy. It doesn't make you smarter to fight those guys. Or you focus on the most freaky people, even if they are smart, like Alexander Dubin. Sometimes you need to really read the best examples of your opposing point of view. Not because most people believe that. They don't. The average Marxist, does not have a particularly robust notion of what Marxism is either. We shouldn't expect them to. Most people don't have the time to invest to become a specialist like that. That's why you can also predict, how people read a thinker by the hermeneutics of their friend groups or by scholars who do specialize in it in the time period in which they're operating, because a lot of people just have to outsource that to somebody else. Now, you should do that as little as possible, but you're still going to do it. So when constructing these narratives, pick the best and read charitably. Read with a hermeneutic of charity first, and then come in with a hermeneutic of suspicion. And don't pick the easy stuff. Don't pick the stuff that's easy to make fun of. Don't pick this, because that's just playing a self-reinforcement game of your own values. And it feels good. I mean, slash 1,000 podcasts ain't changed the world a goddamn bit, though, has it? If it has, it's for the worst. And on that, like and subscribe if you want more things like this. I occasionally do them on the Patreon side. I hope you follow the Varn Below Solos things, because I'm going to have some kind of things that are almost nailing it down level, talking about emotivism and my view of ethics and my view of will. By the way, there's been a lot of debates about me and free will. I'm a compatibilist. I don't actually really believe in true free will. And that I mean counter-causal free will, but I do believe in will and I do believe in agency. So, but you can get bogged down on that. But I'm going to be doing stuff, some kind of Varn blog solo where I take these kind of philosophical positions, including some non-Marxist ones, develop them out, and talk about my own reasoning there, and then maybe how you can apply them. So I hope you stay for this series. Welcome to 2024. This year is probably going to be wild. Have a good year of the dragon. Like and subscribe. I have a Patreon, etc., etc., etc.